right, welcome everyone. This is our second webinar for the month of February as a part of our Your Heart Matters series. Today, we will be having a presentation by one of our prevention consultants, Armando Beleno, on the topic Clear Boundaries, Shared Understanding, A Guide to Consent. This presentation will provide people with a more clear understanding between what consent looks like versus what it doesn't look like. It will help kids and adults understand the gray area of consent and how to navigate through it. A little bit on our speaker for the day, Armando. He is a 22-year-old graduate from Montclair State University who studied psychology. Armando has studied much psychology and has knowledge from adolescent psychology to abnormal psychology. Armando is a music lover whose interests range from rap to K-pop. He has traveled to the countries of Nicaragua and Colombia, where his parents are from, and he has seen the despair of no mental health needs met. He hopes that eventually he'll be able to tighten the gap between those who don't have the means for mental health help. Armando has struggled with his own anxiety and depression and has found ways that work for him to cope healthily that range from journaling to mindful meditation. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Armando for his presentation.
Thank you, Whitney, for that wonderful introduction. First off, I just would like to start off this with a quick little check-in and make sure we are all doing well. So if anybody would like to share how they're doing while I get my slides ready, please do so. All right. Well, if nobody would like to share, I'm gonna get started. So this presentation is called Clear Boundaries, Shared Understanding, A Guide to Consent. And what that means is that it provides us a more deeper look on what consent is and how boundaries play into that. Now, before we get into our presentation today, I am a part of the NJ4S Union Hub, and we aim to support families, and we address both academic and emotional well-being of any individual student. So without further ado, let us get started with the presentation. Now, before I begin, I want to hear from you guys. I want to 100% understand where you guys are coming from. And do you guys know what consent is? If you guys would like to unmute, share, or you guys can comment in the chat. All right, we have one person in the chat. People know what consent is. Now, based on knowledge on what consent is, we can all agree that it kind of takes many different forms. Like there's forms for, well provided in the sort of, it could be informed consent, it could be general consent. We have many different forms. All right, so one major thing that we as people come into contact with when it comes to with consent is that it is seen a lot in TV and film in the media that we consume, and consent is defined as to give assent or approval, compliance and approval with what is done or proposed by another. This can be done through many different forms, many different forms of a medium or some sort. So I'm gonna play this quick little 5-minute video. It's all the consent that we have seen, in our media throughout the years on how it started out, on how it has changed and transformed into today. So I'm going to just play that. Let me know if you guys can hear it or if you guys can't hear it.
The content we consume largely impacts how we perceive the world. Through media consumption, subconscious lessons about reality affect how we think, how we view people, and how we treat people. These involuntary lessons we learn, however, are not always the right ones. This is consent, as seen on film and TV.
You sure it's okay? I don't want to do anything you're not good with.
Don't worry. You got my consent.
Consent is an agreement to engage in an activity. While the term is most commonly used when talking about sex, It is not only applicable to sexual relations.
What about my consent? Excuse me? Who gave you permission to lay your hands on my son?
What?
As I said before, it is an agreement to engage in an activity, and that activity can be anything, from kissing.
I mean, may we? Wait, what?
We may.
To hugging.
I feel like I'm gonna hug you right now. That be all right?
To giving a patient medical treatment.
Are you ready? You say yes, we go to the next step. You say no at any time, we stop.
There are many instances where asking for consent is applicable. Consent should be enthusiastic, meaning looking for the presence of a yes rather than the absence of a no. And of course, consent doesn't have to be verbal. There are nonverbal cues that people give when they are interested in something. The key is recognizing them and making sure to check in with the person or persons you're with.
You okay? Yeah, sorry, just got a little dizzy for a second there. You can stop if you want.
Everyone involved should be fully aware of what they are getting into. And at any point in time, consent can be revoked.
I changed my mind.
You are allowed to change your mind.
This is a hard one, but
If someone is expressing disinterest and does not wish to engage in an activity with you, that is not consent. If you are forcefully preventing that person from leaving,
Not letting you leave.
that is not consent. If someone tells you no,
give me a hug.
No,
Come here.
I'm not coming over there.
or that they are uncomfortable,
I'm making you uncomfortable.
Yes.
if someone is intoxicated,
Who's he?
That's me.
Okay.
It's totally good. Have fun.
if the person is asleep or unconscious,
did all this while I was unconscious.
that is not consent.
What? Rape. That's a rape. This is what raping is.
If someone has an erection,
No, Debbie, that's biology. That's not consent.
if someone is underaged, that is not consent. If you have to coerce someone into having sex with you, whether that's physically forcing yourself on a person, verbally pressuring them,
Okay.
slipping something in their drink, making threats, such as threatening to kill yourself,
Well, you leave me no other choice then.
Oh my God. What are you doing?
trying to convince the person that it won't be so bad.
Don't worry about it. Nobody's watching.
This is not consent. If, after being pressured into it,
No, I can't. I have to be in the city by 10.
the person says yes,
Fine. You can have 3 minutes.
that is not consent. Consent must be voluntary. It is a choice someone makes. If you do not have consent, it is sexual assault or rape. There's no excuse. It doesn't matter how you were dressed,
Girls, don't dress provocatively.
if you're married,
Observe my hands, my dear. I could tear you to pieces with
if your windows and doors weren't locked,
He told me to put a dowel in my sliding doors. You've got to lock them. And your windows.
if you're a man,
They left me on the floor.
if you're asleep, if you're walking alone at night,
Girls, don't walk alone.
if you said stop,
Stop it. Look, just stop it.
if you said no, if you didn't say anything at all,
How about, hey, guys, don't rape?
it isn't your fault. I'm glad that there are at least some positive examples of what consent should look like, because it's important for people to see that consent isn't some silly, ridiculous thing. Consent is about communication. It's about respect. It's about love. That is what consent is. Don't forget it.
Something that in that video I would like to point out. What can we, just from watching that, can we see like how consent in media has been changed throughout the years, like from, the 60s all the way up until now?
Yeah. Some behaviors were so acceptable back in the day. Like
Yeah, very
even
true.
funny, like in the movies,
True. Thank you for sharing. I definitely feel like it's very interesting to watch how, movies depict, marriage, especially that one clip where he's like, look at these hands, like, like basically saying like he's her property. And I, for one, think that that's not how a marriage works. And I feel like, we're very well, informed now that that has changed. Some people may have it that way. Some people may, have it that way, and some others may not. Some, marriages change, they, evolve. So that brings me into the next slide, degendering consent. And what this means is it's more so often left upon that the male is the aggressor, they're never the victim. And we saw in the video prior that men's boundaries can be, crossed. They can be, endangered. It's also very important in society that we don't just exclude other gender identities, we include all of them. All right, so the next part is understanding why consent is important. Now, based off of these 4 reasons, can anybody tell me which one they feel like is more important?
Establishing respect.
Right, thank you for sharing that. I think, for one, when you have a basis, which that is the basis, the respect, it builds everything else. I like to sometimes think, relationships, if you have respect at the bottom, it makes the pillars stand it more effectively. We also have our different types of consent here. Now, this is where we are going to go into the different avenues, from the different types. Now, does anybody know of a type of consent that, isn't just the one that we always focus on? Okay, we are going to move into.
I was gonna say the consent, like, not just for relationships, but for like asking for things as well.
Right, thank you. And that leads me into our first type of consent, general consent, which is what Patrick was saying about how, it's everyday consent. This is the consent where you one-on-one. It doesn't have to be just between, 2 people in like a romantic sense. It could be definitely between 2 friendships. It could be between mother and child. And for an example I can give you, which is a really good one, is let's say if you ask somebody to use their phone, hey, I have to make an important phone call, can I borrow your phone? They say yes, that's a type of consent, they allowed you to. But when you go over their boundaries and you hurt, them, is by, the next time you gotta make a phone call, you just grab their phone and you make that phone call. It's a very risky thing. And the argument for some people is, well, you said I could use it last time. I'm like, but that doesn't refer to it as this time. Consent isn't just a one-time thing. When you ask somebody for their consent, you always have to keep in mind, I have to ask. I have to always apply this in life. And I feel like sometimes in other avenues, this is why it becomes a slippery slope, because people feel like, well, I have that rapport with you already. Why can't I just use it already? And it goes back to the boundaries. This person allowed you to cross this boundary one time, and that doesn't mean that you can continuously cross the boundary. So our next type of consent that we're going to get into is one that I feel like, I'm acquainted with, is definitely informed consent. And this is a type of consent that is done mostly by companies and organizations, and especially in the medical field. And informed consent for these companies, organizations, and anybody in the medical field, it's mostly done to, one, protect the client, protect whoever they are performing the service for, but also it's in turn to protect the company or the organization. It's very flat out and simple. It lays everything out on the table for them. It provides them the purpose and why they're doing it. And A good example of this is, for me in psychology, you know, case studies are a thing. It's where you put people in this controlled environment and you kind of just like see how they react. And the important thing is after the case study is over, you must debrief them and explain to them what was the purpose, what is this information going to be used for. And it's kind of a way to keep that line of like, okay, you signed this, but we're not going to in any way, shape, or form hurt you. It's a good way to kind of respect their boundaries. Now, I can just turn the page. Our next point of view is we are going to be getting into, you know, sexual consent, and of course that touches upon sexual assault. So if anybody feels, you know, if they feel kind of like, you know, they don't want to listen or they don't want to participate, please feel free to turn off your camera. You know, this is a topic that can be difficult to hear about, can be difficult to kind of address. But I'm more so here to kind of just, you know, address it because it has to be addressed when we talk about consent. So sexual consent, I included this really good graphic by Planned Parenthood called FRIES, and it states for freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, and specific. And I feel like in terms of sexual consent, these are great signs for people to really look for when they are getting involved with a partner. The reason why this is a good acronym is because it really adds upon, you know, the basis of what most sexual consent is derived from. So when we talk about freely given, you know, it's always there, you know, in the sense of like where they have a clear head, they're not under the influence, and they're for sure just there communicating with you. There's reversible, meaning you could stop at any time. You can say, I don't want to do this anymore. As we saw in the video, they touched upon this part. And it's also very good to make an informed decision. I really like this one because I didn't really view it as that, as being informed. But the truth of the matter is when you're getting involved with someone sexually, you have to be informed. You know, sometimes people, they need to take account their medical history, they need to take account their sexual history, and they also need to know what's going to be performed or what's going to be happening between both of them. I also really like this next one, enthusiastic. I feel like when you are getting involved with someone sexually, enthusiastically, it always has to be there. You always need to make sure somebody is ready and they want to have sex with you or they want to move forward with you in any way, shape, or form. I included this bullet point at the bottom. Just because someone wants to make out with you doesn't mean they want to have sex with you, because through my research, I have seen that a lot of young adults have really seen, well, yeah, we were making out, you know, we were getting to that point, so I assumed. And I heard somebody say that, and I was like, I totally agree, because just because somebody wants to, you know, make out with you and be with you in that sense, it doesn't mean that they want to move forward and they don't want to kind of, you know, like move into the sexual experience. It could be they just want to make out. Now, based out of these 5, I want to hear from you guys once more. You know, this is what this is about, having an open and honest discussion. Which out of these 5 do you think is important?
I think the reversible one is really important because you see a lot in media, movies like that someone starts and then maybe it's oftentimes a woman, it's like, no, actually I don't want to. And then the guy is like, oh, are you going to make me do anything? Like, I'm already turned on. And so shaming the woman for having doubts, shaming the woman for changing her mind is often what happens so much.
Thank you for sharing that. And that's something that we will be touching upon, is those kind of like the mental manipulation that some people have to endure when they don't want to have sex with somebody. I'm gonna turn to the chat because I see we got a little thing. Safa says specific, I think specific because it gives clear-cut communication. And that is one thing that I am a big, I back up a lot, is communication and understanding where you guys want to continue and where you guys want to stop, you know, each other's boundaries. And I say boundaries a lot because, well, that is one of the points of the presentation, but as well as to understand that us as individuals, we need those clear, you know, healthy boundaries. And, you know, healthy boundaries are defined in many ways. Would anybody else like to touch upon it. Oh, I see another one. Rachel says, I think enthusiasm is really important because if you aren't excited, maybe the situation shouldn't occur. And that is extremely true. You know, there are a lot of times in relationships where people feel like, well, I'm doing this because they want to, not because I want to. And I feel like at that point, it's not ideal and it's not one right for you as a person. And once again, that goes back to the boundaries that you establish. So our next portion, like I said, we're going to be touching briefly on what sexual assault is. Now, when we talk about, you know, consent, sexual assault is a necessary point because whenever, you know, we see the stories in the news, it's always on, you know, this person was assaulted, this woman or man was assaulted, and, you know, the basis point is that there wasn't any consent giving or boundaries were crossed. And, you know, the force, I feel like, is highlighted a lot in these news, like, oh, this person was pushed down, this person was, you know, restricted. But we never speak on the psychological or manipulative tactics that are used. You know, I hear a lot, like in my research, I heard a lot that survivors were saying, oh, he told me that he loved me, or he told me that if you love me, why don't you sleep with me, or why don't we, you know, make love? And so the person gave in. And, you know, after that, you know, they got ghosted or they were never spoken to after. And that really hurt her because, you know, she felt as if though, you know, she was just used to kind of get something that he wanted. And I feel like we see a lot of that because we don't go back to the fundamentals, which is boundaries and consent. We don't see, you know, this taught in schools a lot. I mean, it's been implemented in some ways or another, but it is not currently a part of a curriculum. They just talk about sexual assault as a basis and about what happens with it and what it is, not about how we kind of need to put a stop to it by implementing these basic curriculums, I feel like. Now, it's very important to know this, and I feel like all of us here, if we've got to this point, consent should not or manipulative in any way, shape, or form. It should be open and honest. So our next point is going to be exploring the gray area of consent. Now, this is something that, of course, I feel like we've all heard about in the sense of like, well, before I assume that we all heard about, has anybody heard of this phrase, the gray area of consent or gray area? Okay, I see a couple of people saying yes, a couple of people shaking their head. Oh. So, in terms of the gray area of consent, it's that area where you don't know whether it was consensual or if it wasn't, and that's because there is no basis of communication. All right, let us continue. Something that plays into this, I've heard many stories of where people don't realize if something is consensual because they were under the influence of any sort of substance. Now, one question that I've seen is, okay, we were not that drunk, we were able to consent, is this still not consensual? And according to law, drugs and alcohol impact decision-making and blur consent. So therefore, if it is included in this, were you guys really consensual? And I feel like this is where a lot of people kind of have that, like, well, I was cool with it in the moment. Yes, I was under the influence, so was he though. And a lot of people don't view this as a sort of crossing the line. But one thing I want to make clear, and I feel like we all can contest to this, is somebody who's under the influence cannot give written consent or verbal consent because they're not in the right headspace. Now, one thing I want to ask you guys is, what do you guys think of this? Do you guys think this is true? Do you guys think if you guys are if you're both under the influence, is it consensual? Now, personally, I feel like this is a good question to ask because I've heard many mixed reviews by it. It was consensual. I mean, I didn't have an issue with it. I don't have an issue with it today. Now, other people, John C. she wrote, no, that it's not. Rachel says, no, it's not consent. If you are under the influence, substances alter your reality. This is all good truths. I, for one, agree that when you're under the influence, it does affect your decision. It impairs your decision making and what you want to do and continue with your partner. But a lot of the times people tend to bend this line because of that idea. And it's important to understand that under no circumstances it is consensual. It is not consensual at all. We have one more in the chat. Better to be safe than sorry and not to engage in anything unless all parties are sober. I 100% agree with that. Thank you. All right. So the next part of this presentation is going to continue with the gray area, and addressing it is called asking for consent and nonverbal consent. Now, nonverbal consent is, of course, understanding the situation, those cues like they were talking about in the video, So these are signs that you don't really receive any clarity on. This is everything that happens in the moment. So a good example is two people, they are kissing, clothes are coming off, but your partner doesn't look that enthusiastic about it, like in fries. At that point, what would you do? Now, a lot of people say continue, a lot of people say don't continue. My thing is to ask for that consent, is to just sit there and be like, hey, are you comfortable with this? Do you want to continue? And people's response to that argument is more so, but I don't want to kill the mood. And it's more so, it's not really killing the mood, it's more so understanding, is it okay if I cross this boundary? Is asking that question. Next, this is going into, of course, that nonverbal signs and bridging that gap and having that form of communication. Now, it's important to understand that nonverbal signs and communication need to be cleared, because if you continue, these are some signs that you can see that they are not interested. So we have avoiding your partner's touch, being silent, turning your body away, looking tense or worried, not participating, and then avoiding that eye contact. Most people have a hard time picking up on nonverbal signs of communication, especially because most nonverbal signs can be very misleading. Out of these 6 that I have put up here on the slideshow, what is one that you have kind of seen before?
Avoiding eye contact.
Right. Thank you for that. I genuinely feel like when somebody is avoiding eye contact, it could be multiple forms of why they are not enjoying it or why they don't want to continue. But I feel like that is a key underlier, my apologies, of why they don't want to continue. And that's where you come in, the partner, and to be like, hey, listen, are you okay? Do you want me to stop? Or do you want to talk about it? And then this is where it boils down to one simple fact, and that's communication. We need to have that communication between each other. One thing I really liked hearing is, if you're not comfortable talking about sex, then maybe you're not ready to have it as a couple. And I feel like a lot of people, they feel like, oh, well, that doesn't really apply to us, or that doesn't really apply to my situation that I'm in. And the truth of the matter is, it does apply to every situation, because if that person does not want to talk about it, they're not comfortable with it. So our next portion of the presentation is going to be looking at the effects of no consent. And what that means is, seeing like, okay, so I didn't consent to this. What could happen if it's broken? What could happen if it's crossed? Now, I inputted this little graphic because I thought it was kind of a good depiction of what general consent was. So he's saying, thank you for letting me borrow your car. She's like, no problem. And then the next week he just comes and he takes her car away, and then she's over here explaining, you can't just do that. And he's confused about that consent that he was, given last week. All right. So these are the 3 reasons as to why it is important. Without consent, trust. I feel like we talk a lot about consent, boundaries, but trust often leads to when boundaries are crossed, when they're allowed to be crossed. So more so it would happen because there would be a sense of rights that would have, been violated of that. The next one would be boundaries. Boundaries are a big component when it comes to building strong, lasting, and healthy relationships. And without having that consent, there wouldn't be those boundaries. And I feel like in relationships, when there isn't that line of healthy communication and healthy boundary setting, there is going to be that imbalance of power. There will most likely be that abuse that will be happening. And abuse is something that, we want to prevent. So next thing is going to be effective ways to consent. So in this portion of the presentation, we are going to be, kind of talking about how can we kind of talk about this or kind of leave an open line of this communication so that we don't miss these consensual acts. I 100% think it goes down to this, it boils down to this, setting those healthy boundaries. So in the sense of these are the three categories that people tend to have. They tend to have rigid, they tend to have porous or healthy boundaries. So one thing I want to ask you guys is out of these three lines, let's focus on healthy boundaries at this point. Out of those healthy boundaries, which one do you think is the most helpful to have, the best, the most beneficial, if you will? Oh, there you go. All right, we have a message in the chat. Accepting no's. Accepting when others say no to them. I have a question for you guys. Why do you guys think this is a hard boundary to have for most people nowadays?
I think now, especially, bringing it back to youth, because we do work with, we do work in that realm. I think youth have a huge difficulty in establishing boundaries, and not only just establishing them, but just sticking to them, because, the notion of being accepted, the notion of, well, if I don't, if I don't agree with what someone wants of me, or if I'm not comfortable, and that person, might ridicule me, might shame me, might, start rumors, X, Y, and Z. So I think youth have a difficult time because they see, they might align not having boundaries with being more accepted amongst their peers.
That is very true. Thank you for sharing, Safa. Natalie says respecting boundaries are hard for youth as well because they may like the risk being defiant. It's a thrill for them. That is very true. I feel like we see this a lot, especially back in, I'll give an example. Back in high school, kids, they would test the teacher all the time because it would just be like, okay, let's see how far I can push this person to the break. And some teachers, they would break because it's sometimes hard. Now, let's focus on rigid and porous boundaries. How do you feel like being dependent on the opinions of others, how can you feel like that can actually turn into a healthy boundary? So let me expand on that. And what I mean by being dependent on others' opinions, I feel like we tend to see that as somebody who's very needy on what another person is saying, or getting their okay for certain things. I personally feel like that being dependent on others, it's a good thing in the sense of if you talk with somebody who is skilled, let's say in work, we come to our supervisors for that opinion because they know a little bit more about it. So to get their input, it's more so bettering what we're doing. See in the chat. Oh, okay. I see Lisa as well. I would forget that I have boundaries until someone lets me know that I am human, not a robot. I realize that when it comes to youth and young adults, I believe that some of them do not know that they have boundaries, or they do not know what is boundaries for them, to put their foot down and say, hey, I feel this way, or I feel that way. Those type of boundaries. That is a very good thing to say. I personally agree with this. I feel like in the terms of kids, they tend to kind of not understand what boundaries are until, for example, they cross the boundary and then a parent kind of reprimands them. So that is a very good input. Thank you so much, Missy. Understanding the line of it's okay to ask others' opinions and not letting it get to a point where it creates heightened anxiety and stress of fear of breaking a boundary. That is very good. I feel like when somebody gets to like they're about to break the boundary, that's when people they tense up and they tend to kind of be defensive, and instead of explaining, hey, this is not okay and I'll tell you why. And that is a very good example of how it happens. Thank you so much for sharing. Now, sometimes boundaries, they are necessary to be able to consent effectively. Most people struggle with setting good boundaries. Most people might be very protective of their personal information and not want to give it out. But effectively, to set that boundary, they need to share personal information in an appropriate manner and make sure that it's not over or undersharing. Now, I feel like, boundaries are something that we're all working on as human beings, and we tend to be good at some more than the others. I, for one, know that I am very good at valuing my own opinions, and I'm not that dependent on opinions of others. But I feel like I see the benefit of getting others' opinions to better myself. So in turn, I'm making myself better by kind of indulging in a porous boundary self. All right. Next, we are going to have being straightforward. Now, straight up, just, opening up to your person, opening up to that partner that you have gotten to this point with, and asking questions. And once you ask for permission explicitly, they're able to be like, you know what, yes, I want to continue. And, asking phrases also like, can I kiss you here, or can we have sex? All of this can ultimately lead to better communication and establish more of a strong relationship because you're able to be open and honest with your partner. All right. Now, this next part is going to be more being partner focused. So being able to understand, okay, let me not focus on my needs, my wants. Let me focus on what my partner wants. So once again, asking straightforward, do you want me to kiss you here on your neck? Or understanding what they want to continue. We have something from the chat. Direct communication, exactly. Thank you, Natalie, thank you. Now it may seem like something for some people it may seem like, but like, shouldn't they know or shouldn't they understand? And I feel like we tend to be misinformed about that, in the sense of sometimes people don't know, because especially when you're having sex for the first time, sex is so new to the person. They have to be open and honest with you enough so you know and you understand. All right, so this is just a quick little recap of everything that we have talked about today. We defined consent. We talked about the different types of consent. We went through the gray area of consent, having effects of no consent, and ways to affect, better. Now, before we close, I want to ask you guys, I want to open the floor, ask if you guys have any questions for me.
I think it's really important, because we are all adults, that we model what we teach for our youth. So for example, when it comes to boundaries, maybe some of us are parents, maybe we're not, maybe we're older siblings, XYZ. I think it's important to teach boundaries, because you're not born, it's not an innate skill, or it's not something that we're born with. It's important to teach and model that type of behavior, and that also goes along with consent. So I think that's the whole purpose of us, being educators in this topic, and I think you did a really good job, Armando. So overall, it's our duty to give out that knowledge and skill for our youth. So good job, Armando. Thank you for the presentation. Very informative.
Thank you for your feedback. Let me turn to the chat really quick. It says here, oh wow. I believe that these type of forums are extremely beneficial. The lessons that children, teenagers, and young adults learn about boundaries now will contribute to the development of healthy adult relationships in the future. I am participating in this call because I have noticed that some adults I interact with at my daycare center have not the opportunity to witness positive relationships and lack of understanding of healthy boundaries. As a result, they find themselves in abusive and unhealthy relationships. It is important to remember that this is never too late to learn these valuable lessons. That is very well said, and thank you so much for participating. Missy says, teaching and showing boundaries to others, let them know how they feel and what they can do in the world and the community. There is not much education and workshops about this. That is very true. Well, if that's all the questions we have, I want to thank you guys first and foremost for coming to this presentation and, having this discussion and open communication that we are established. Thank you. I'll turn it back over to Whitney.
Thank y'all so much. I'm going to this. Thank y'all so much for joining us today. I'm gonna put a link in the chat for copy the link. I'm going to put a link in the chat for our feedback form. If you have any feedback for NJ4S or Armando on this presentation, we greatly appreciate it. Any feedback will be anonymous, and it helps improve for further presentations down the road. So we greatly appreciate it if you filled that out. Thank you again for joining us today. For our Your Heart Matters webinar series. You can find us on social media at NJ4S Union. That's NJ, the number 4S Union. We are also in the process of uploading the recordings of these Zooms webinars onto the Prevention Links YouTube channel. So you can check out some of our past presentations that we've had on there as well. And if you liked what you saw here today and you want to get a presentation like this for your school or community center or youth group, please do not hesitate to reach out. You can email us. You can email us at NJ, the number 4S Union at preventionlinks.org.